Okay, so once we've got our raised bed situation under control, now we need to think about a cover element to keep us out of the weather. Obviously we can put a fire in front of this and we'll be talking about that as we go, but let's talk about what we're going to do for cover element. Now in a temporary situation, obviously we can put any tarp that we have with us. We've strategically placed this bed between two trees a little bit back from center line, so that if we string a tarp up across here, it's going to cover this bed as long as we put ourselves an overhang out here. And that's the key element to that, is to have that overhang. Now, that's all dependent on the size of your tarp. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a canvas tarp on this, because I'd like to make this a little bit more of a temporary semi-permanent type shelter, or a station camp, where I can go from, you know, one camp out to the trap line to this camp and then back if I decide I want to spend the night in between times on a trap line or something like that. So this will be like a stationary camp area that I can use in between the base camp that's back at the Pathfinder School classroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a larger tarp here. It's a 10 by 10, but it will set up the same as any tarp would set up. So you can use this tarp, or this example, as how I would set up any other tarp. Now, your tarp is going to be a temporary situation, but it can always be used to cover over anything else that you have in the interim until you get it set up solid. And that's the key, is you don't have to do all of this stuff in one day or in one shot. The best thing for us to do would be to put up some type of pole, solid beam across these two trees, so that we have that solid ridge pole, and then we can build a shelter off of that, which we will do over time. But for the temporary, we can throw the tarp up there, and that will keep the weather off of us while we're building a heavier duty shelter. Stay with me and we'll get that set up. Okay, so now that we have our raised bed set up, we need to put some type of a tarp over it, even if this is going to be a temporary type camp. I'm using the 8x8 trail tarp from Derek Faria at the Woodsman School. Really good friend of mine, instructor at the Pathfinder School. I've got his 8x8 tarp out here, and what I've done is I've just taken the tarp in the center, right above the center of this raised bed, and I've stretched it out between two trees, and I haven't used a continuous ridge line on this. I've used two separate pieces of cordage with the same trucker's hitch type knot into the loop jam that we used in our earlier videos in this series to pull it taut, and then I'm going to stake it down in the back, and then we'll see where we're at, and we'll talk about the configuration of this tarp and why we're doing it this way in just a minute. Okay, so this is our finished temporary camp. If this was a colder weather environment, and I mean, when I say cold, I mean even down in the 40s at night is no picnic when it's, you know, in the 80s during the day, or 75 during the day. But if it's going to get down lower than that, same situation. What you want to do now is you want to make sure that the back of your tarp is shored up very well. You don't want to see any daylight underneath the back of that tarp. So get your rake back out and start raking some debris up over the top of the back of that tarp to hold that down. I've got a stick in the middle of this tarp. I've got both sides on the outside pulled down at a pretty steep angle, just a little higher than the bed. I've got plenty of room inside there to get in, but this right here, there's a reason for this stick. Number one, I can't guide this out with a tarp, or with a tarp line, because I'm going to have a fire out here. So it's going to burn my tarp line. But this stick, lifting this up, and this is just a real simple forked stick that I just stuck in this tie-out loop. I cut it to the size I wanted it and put it in the ground. And what that does is that gives me a little bit of an upsweep in my peak, so that my fire, the radiant heat from my fire, can get inside that shelter and give me convective warming. Okay, just like we talked about yesterday. Conduction, convection, and radiation. Those are all the things that you need to understand to manipulate, or how to manipulate. And if you can manipulate those three things, you can keep yourself safe, warm, and get a good night's sleep. And that's what's important, is getting a good night's sleep. When you're in the bush, I don't care if it's for 2 days, 3 days, a week, you got to sleep. Like I said in one of my past 21st century long hunter videos, you know, George Washington Sears, Horace Kephart, Daniel Boone, Simon Kenton, Christopher Gist, all of those guys that traveled along the frontier areas of the eastern United States could do one thing very, very well. They knew how to get a good night's sleep. And a lot of those guys in modern times carried what they called a browse bag. And a browse bag basically was just a canvas sack. Think of a pillowcase that's the size of your body. And they would stuff that with debris, pine boughs, whatever the case may be. And that's what they would use for their mattress. And it would fold up very small inside their pack. And that's not a bad lick either, for sure. But if you're going to use a wool blanket, and you could use a wool blanket in conjunction with that, but if you've got the modern conveniences of having sleeping pads and things like that, then you can use those. And two things that I would recommend that you carry while we're talking about sleeping, especially in a wintertime environment, make sure that you have a decent sleeping pad that's pretty much indestructible as far as the weather goes. This is just an exercise mat from Walmart. It's a real thick one. I think it's a Gold's Gym brand or something like that. They're like 20 bucks. But I've slept on this thing on the ground in temperatures down to -9 degrees in an MMS sleep system in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And it's really good for battling conduction problems. But it's also pretty soft. So if I put that on top of this raised bed of logs, it's going to give me a little bit of a cushion. The other thing I like to carry in the wintertime is just one of these hunting seats. And you can buy these on the off season from places like Menards and Walmart for less than $5. But anytime you've got to sit down, whether it's in camp on your knees, whether it's setting traps on the trap line, whether it's sitting down in camp doing tasks in front of the fire, whatever the case may be, if you sit on this, it's going to take away a lot of that conductive heat loss from your body from sitting directly on the ground or kneeling directly on the ground. So something like this can be worth its weight in gold. And for a winter pack out setup, you know, I would say if you're traveling without these two things, there's something wrong with your head. But in the wintertime, you're going to carry more gear. You need to understand that. And that may have to make you incorporate some type of a sled or a bigger backpack or some kind of a travois situation, but some type of conveyance that you can put a few more pieces of gear in, especially if you're running a trap line or doing a long-term hunting scenario or something like that. You're going to need to carry more gear, and a sled's a really good way to do that. We'll talk about that more this winter. But things like these heavier tarps and bigger pieces of gear like these conduction mats and conduction pads, I call them, those type of things, and bow saws and larger axes are very conducive to carry by a sled or some type of conveyance, even if it's horseback. But I wanted to show you what this setup looks like, because this would be what I would do in the interim before I could build a more permanent type shelter. This is what I would do. And the way this is set up is the one side of this tarp is a little bit lower on this end than it is on this end. And the reason for that is I want this thing to shed water if it decides to rain. So if it rains, all that water is going to run down to one side and go off, which is where I can put a collection pail or something like that if I'm going to collect rainwater. But at the same time, it allows all that water to go to one area and not sit in my tarp somewhere and cause a big puddle. These tarps are pretty dang waterproof, but you don't want water sitting on them long period or long term either. So if you're going to set something like this, leave something like this set up for any period of time, you want to make sure there's no way water can be standing on the shelter. Okay guys, a couple final thoughts real quick before we end this part of the video, or this part of the series. If you notice on this bed, one side of this bed or one end of this bed, the tripods are just a little bit shorter than the other end, and there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is you never want to sleep with your head downhill. You'll wake up with a headache you will not believe in the morning because of blood flow. So you really want to get your head above that level line. The easy way to do that is to make sure that your bed's a little bit off level and that your head's on the high end. That will take care of those problems. One of the things that I think is the most underrated part of bushcraft and survival, self-reliance, whatever you want to call it, whether it's short-term or long-term, is a good night's sleep.